numerous known and presumed conspirators. Ultimately, 4 of the conspirators we'll be discussing. 4 were sentenced to, and 1 escaped and was eventually and controversially. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Well-Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. We'll also discuss in some detail the various devices that have been deployed throughout time. I'm your host, Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. Today's show will concentrate on the numerous known and presumed conspirators of the infamous John Wilkes Booth. Each of these people played various roles in the wider plot to assassinate not only President Lincoln, but also other very prominent members of the American government as the Civil War drew to a close. So join us as we learn about a cagey crew of characters that have mostly been forgotten by history, but we'll do our best to bring them back to life here. And a quick note, for a deeper dive into the life and deeds of Booth himself, please check out the preceding episode of this podcast entitled Bad Actor, Booth and Lincoln. To best tell our story and to try to understand what actually transpired and went down, it's very important to remember that Booth had originally planned to kidnap Lincoln, and Lincoln alone, not to assassinate him, but to kidnap him. We know that he divulged his plans and stages for at least 2 years prior to the plot eventually having been played out. And he did so with a wily group of fellow travelers, and it's a mixed bag for sure. These folks range from childhood friends in the border regions of the Mid-Atlantic from which he hailed, as well as to be expected Confederate soldiers from the deeper South. But they also oddly included professional acquaintances from the sort of nascent theater world in the U.S. of the time, where he was very prominent. And his contacts also seem to have reached as far as Confederate sympathizers and spies operating in the North and as far away as Canada. But as Richmond fell and the South surrendered, the kidnap plot turned into something much more sinister. And this change of plans happened very suddenly, very sporadically, and very fatally. As the plot thickens, it becomes much wider, and it was meant to claim the lives not only of the president now, but the vice president, the secretary of state, and the commanding general of the victorious Union Army. In other words, Booth was going to do what he was going to do. He was going to fight the power. What can we say? As if the kidnapping plot was not batshit crazy enough, the wider murderous plan takes delirium and madness to a wider stage that only Booth the actor could have contemplated. As we will see, while Booth's acting skills are up for debate, his directorial skills are the same. The Helter Skelter was due to take place simultaneously on April 14, 1865 at 3 different locations in Washington, D.C., but as we'll soon learn, thankfully things did not mostly go off as planned. Ultimately, 4 of the conspirators we'll be discussing were hanged, 4 were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, and 1 escaped and was eventually and controversially exonerated. And that latter guy, for what it's worth, was definitely complicit, but we'll get into him a little bit later. So let's delve further into the roles of the aforementioned and the others that were ultimately sentenced to prison or death. So as we get to the main cast, let's keep in mind that there were many other walk-ons, understudies, and cameo performers that never really made the final credits of our show. Many of these folks were interrogated and some were briefly detained, but all were later acquitted. So for the sake of time and focus, we'll direct our attention to those that paid very grave consequences for their parts in one of the most panned theatrical performances in American history. In no particular order, we'll begin with Samuel Bland Arnold, born in Georgetown, D.C., 1834. He attended St. Timothy's Hall, a military academy in Maryland, where he was introduced to a fellow classmate, J.W. Booth. And he was a Southern sympathizer, and he joined the Confederate Army in 1861, right around the outset of the Civil War. And his service lasted about 3 years, and he was finally discharged from service in 1864 due to failing health. Once out of uniform, he rekindles a relationship with his former classmate and was known to meet with Booth and other fellow conspirators at Gautier's restaurant in Washington. This is where he likely learned of Booth's intentions and he agreed to join in the kidnapping plot. He would later admit to his complicity in this plan, but at his trial, he vehemently denied any involvement in the eventual assassination. And this is most likely true, as he had taken a job as a clerk in Virginia, and his alibi of being nowhere near the murderous scenes that were to take place, they were all corroborated by several co-workers. But nevertheless, he was arrested and he was convicted by a military tribunal of conspiracy, and he was sentenced to life in prison with hard labor, along with 3 others we'll discuss, at Fort Jefferson off the Florida Keys in the Dry Tortugas. But life was not life in the end, as he was pardoned by then-President Andrew Johnson a few years later, and he was released from confinement in 1869. Following his release, he lived quietly and anonymously in the D.C. area for the rest of his life, and he died there in 1906. He was the second longest living survivor of the plot, next to only John Surratt, who will come later. Enter stage left or stage right, or whatever you prefer, is Michael O'Loughlin. Born in Baltimore, June of 1840, and he was another childhood friend and also a neighbor of Booth, and he was one of his earliest known comrades. And like Arnold, he too was a Confederate soldier, but served only a year or so before returning to Baltimore, where he plied his skills in various trades. He was another diner at Gautier's, where he surely had Booth's ear. His role is forever clouded in mystery as to the extent of his involvement, but he definitely was involved. At his trial, the prosecutors accused him of being assigned to assassinate Ulysses S. Grant. Now, that never happened, as we've discussed in our previous episode. Was this serendipity, or was this just happenstance? No one seems to know, though he was accused of this by some of his fellow conspirators, and it is proven that he was lurking around D.C. on the evening of the assassination. And he surrendered 2 days after the deadly deed, and like the others we're discussing, was hauled in front of a tribunal. They found him guilty, and he too was sentenced to life at Dry Tortugas. But this time, life meant life, as he died there a few years later of a yellow fever epidemic that swept through the prison. And if you'd like to pay him a visit, his remains rest along with Arnold and Booth at Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore. On deck, and now stepping up to the plate, is Edmund Spangler. We'll call him Ned, as he was called during the day. This guy was born in Pennsylvania in 1825, and he moved to Maryland while in his 20s. He was a carpenter and a general laborer who helped build and upkeep Tudor Hall. Tudor Hall was the summer retreat of Junius Booth and his growing family. And it was there that he met and befriended John Wilkes Booth, who would have been a very young lad at this time. So through these familial connections, Spangler was later hired as a carpenter and stagehand at Ford's Theater, where the two rekindled their friendship. He's reported to have been a simple man and a heavy drinker, and he was likely proud to have spent time in the company of the now famous actor. He was also known as a fervent supporter of slavery and therefore the Confederate cause in general. On the day of the assassination, Booth appeared at Ford's Theater, as we all know, and he invited Spangler and some other stagehands for a drink at a nearby tavern. He mentioned that he may return that evening for the performance of the play My American Cousin, which Lincoln and his wife Mary Todd would be attending. Booth arrived at the theater at about 9:30 p.m. and he left his horse in Spangler's care. And after shooting Lincoln at about 10 minutes after 10, Booth escapes, boards the horse under Spangler's care, and disappears into the night. Spangler was questioned the next day and released, but he was then arrested 2 days later and taken into custody as an accomplice in aiding and abetting in the scheme. He was also charged with barring the door to the balcony that allowed Booth to escape. At the tribunal, he was found not guilty of conspiracy, but guilty of complicity in allowing the escape. And for this, he received 6 years, and he was transferred also to Dry Tortugas along with Arnold, O'Loughlin, and Dr. Mudd. We haven't really talked about Dr. Mudd yet, but we will. While in this tropical hell that was Fort Jefferson, he assisted Mudd during the yellow fever outbreak at the prison there and eventually treated Mudd after he too caught the disease. He also built the coffins for those who died from the outbreak. He was released on March 1st of 1869, and he returned to the D.C. area, where he was rehired by John Ford. In 1873, he moved in with Mudd and his family and was given 5 acres to farm. He performed carpentry work in the area, was a general handyman, it seems, and he died of respiratory failure in 1875. In a handwritten note by Spangler, recovered by Dr. Mudd after his death, he swore that while he knew Booth, he played no role whatsoever in the plot, and he had never discussed Lincoln with Booth. Now it's John Surratt. Oh, John Surratt, that lucky bastard. He was born in 1844 in Washington, D.C. He was the son of John Sr. and Mary Jenkins Surratt, and his mother, as it turned out, would not be so lucky as her son. His parents were known to be devout Catholics, and he spent some time studying for the priesthood. But most relevant to our story is that he served as a spy in the Confederate Secret Service. Not really sure why he never enlisted, but he definitely was a spy for the Confederacy. His family owned a tavern and lodgings in Maryland, not far out of D.C. This place was known as a sort of mothership for Southern sympathizers in this very disputed part of the country. Like Ford's Theater itself, the Surratt property would prove to be crucial in the whole unwinding of the Lincoln assassination. John was most likely introduced to Booth by Dr. Mudd, and this probably happened at the National Hotel in D.C., where Booth maintained a permanent residence. There's really no question that he was privy to the kidnapping plot, and I think research implicates him in the wider plan. But was he there in D.C. when the bullets hit the fan? No, he was not. In fact, he was in Elmira, New York, of all places. Why was he there? We're not sure, but he was probably just scared, and he ran away and found himself in that town. From there, he manages to cross the border and was given sanctuary by a priest in Quebec, and he remained in Montreal and its environs throughout the course of the trials that were to follow. But he ain't done running. From Canada, he's off to Liverpool, where again he's sheltered by a parish priest there. And next it's off to Rome, and maybe this guy should have joined the clergy after all, you think? But no, that's not our Johnny. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and when in Rome, well, he goes by the alias John Watson, and he joins the Ninth Regiment of the Pontifical Zouaves. Now, this is not the time or place to go into the Zouaves, but that's a very interesting group, and feel free to check out their outfits. They actually did play a particular role in the Civil War. I'm not sure if he was ever truly affiliated with them, but the outfit is a very colorful and eccentric choice of a disguise. Despite his efforts, this clown costume does not keep his identity secret, and he's arrested and he's handed over to American authorities in Italy. But wait, he's not done yet. He somehow escapes captivity yet again, and now posing as a Canadian citizen, he boards a ship to Alexandria in Egypt. It seems that whatever name he calls himself or whatever costume he was wearing there, that didn't work either, and he was again arrested, and this time, 1867, a few years later, he was sent back to the U.S. for his role in the plot to kill Lincoln that had happened earlier. He was tried in Maryland civil court, and maybe it was amnesia, but he was acquitted, surprisingly, by a vote of 8-4. His later years were rather banal. He tried his hand at tobacco farming and failed, but he did marry Francis Scott Key's cousin. He became a teacher, and he lived out his rather long life back home in Maryland, dying there in 1916. Now it's time to get into the mud. Dr. Samuel Mudd, that is. And his story is perhaps best known of the conspirators, and his role is probably the most controversial. So here's what we know about him. His dates are 1833 to 1883, and he lived and died in rural Maryland. But he spent some time sweating it out behind prison walls in Dry Tortugas. He was both a medical doctor and a tobacco farmer, and he owned a plantation that was worked by almost 100 slaves at its height. And as such, it's no surprise he was a strong defender of the Confederacy, and he seems to be very upset about the equivocacy of Maryland and its very complicated role as a border state in the Civil War. Now, how did he get connected to Booth? It's not really confirmed, but he claims that he met the actor by chance one day, just out and about in D.C. Now, that seems very implausible. The other story is that Booth met him while discussing the purchase of some of his land, as Mudd's financial situation had become precarious following the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. But it is clear that he was definitely acquainted with Booth in one way or another. He had great defenders of his innocence ever since the events of the assassination, but we have to be clear on a few fronts. It is a known and established fact that Booth and his accomplice, David Harold, headed on horseback to Mudd's home directly following the Lincoln assassination, and they reached their destination about 6 hours after the attack. That would have been around 4 a.m. that evening or the next morning. It's also known that he bandaged Booth's broken fibula and was paid for this by Booth, and he harbored the fugitives for at least a night, maybe even 2 or somewhere in between, and he definitely did not alert the authorities. And perhaps most damning for him was the fact that when initially questioned by the cops, he denied knowing Booth, which he later recanted after evidence to the contrary became obvious at his trial. Pretty quickly, he was a person of interest and was interrogated several times, but on the day of Booth's death, he was officially charged with conspiracy to commit murder, and he was dragged off to the tribunal along with the other stars of our show. He was found guilty of this crime and escaped the penalty of execution by just 1 vote, that vote being 5-4. So instead, he received the life term and he was sent to Fort Jefferson along with the others. I don't think we've mentioned it before, but Fort Jefferson was essentially this austere outpost in the tropics where the other 600 or so prisoners there were comprised almost entirely of Union deserters. And so the Booth conspirators must have been oddly received when they arrived there. Despite a failed jailbreak, he became the de facto medic at the prison after the fever that swept through claimed the life of the previous doctor. And he appears to have been well liked and respected by many others whose lives he probably saved. And many of those other surviving prisoners petitioned Andrew Johnson on his behalf, and he was pardoned along with Spangler and Arnold by Johnson in February 1869. He returned to his farm and his medical practice in Maryland and dabbled in local politics. He ran unsuccessfully for the U.S. House. Now, can you believe that? He ended up dying of pneumonia back on his property at the age of 49. It's worth noting that since his death, and even before, generations of his family members and others have sought to clear his name. And even Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan agreed with these protestations. And I don't think there's a lot that those two ever agreed on. But in the end, in the eyes of the law, his name remains Mudd, and his guilty sentence has never been expunged. Now, following a short break, we'll turn our attention to the plotters that suffered the ultimate penalty as a result of the assassination of the president. We'll start with Lewis Powell, who also went by many aliases, mainly Lewis Payne. He was born Lewis Thornton Powell in Randolph, Alabama in 1844, and he was the youngest of the conspirators, 20 years old at the time of the events that took place. Though born in Alabama, he joined the Confederate Army in Florida, where his family had moved prior to the war, and specifically, he enlisted in the 2nd Florida Infantry at the age of 17. He was known to be a particularly fervent Confederate, and is said to have killed several Union opponents in battle. It was even rumored that he may have used a Union soldier's skull as an ashtray. Powell fought in several important battles, including the Peninsula Campaign, which claimed more than 50,000 casualties on both sides and was considered an early and bloody Southern victory. He also saw action in other theaters, including Fredericksburg and Gettysburg. He was eventually shot and seriously wounded at Gettysburg, where he was taken as a POW. After he recovered, he was sent into forced labor as a medical orderly in Baltimore. And it was while in Baltimore he escaped with the assistance of a nurse named Maggie Branson, whose mother harbored him at her boarding house. And this was a known refuge of Southern sympathizers. And there's a hint here. We're going to learn some more about boarding houses. Powell then joins the notorious Mosby's Rangers and then the Confederate Secret Service. So this guy is really, really a serious rebel. It's during this period that he adopts the name Lewis Payne, P-A-Y-N-E, And supposedly that was the surname of a friend and a mentor, and I guess meant to kind of keep his real identity secret. And he probably met with conspirators John Surratt and Louis Weichmann at this time, and they would have introduced him to Booth. It is known that Powell met with Booth at a place called Barnum's Hotel in Baltimore in February 1865. Now, that was just a month or so before the assassination. Powell and Booth became fast friends and both trusted each other implicitly. Booth took care of Powell's bills and set him up at a hotel in D.C. It was during this intervening period that he was arrested for beating a black maid, and he claimed to be an 18-year-old who knew nothing about the Civil War, and he had also had trouble with speaking the English language. Okay, I think this guy knew a lot about the Civil War, and as to speaking the English language, I mean, I know he's from the Deep South, but I think he spoke the English language, maybe differently than they did in the D.C. area. But he was released after just 2 days in jail after swearing an oath of allegiance to the United States government. Booth convenes all of the conspirators and announces his change in plans to kidnap Lincoln at Ford's Theater and not in the countryside as previously was arranged. Booth selects Powell to be the primary kidnapper, as he's considered to be the physically strongest of the whole group. Booth and Powell travel together to Toronto and Montreal and meet with escaped Confederates in these places, and it's never been established what the exact purpose of these meetings were. It is assumed that Powell did not really realize that the kidnapping plot had been changed by Booth to an assassination plot until the night before or even the day of the event. And at this point, Powell was assigned to murder the Secretary of State William Seward at his home. And this is a very dramatic event, which is rarely remembered. So let's do our best to briefly describe what actually took place there. At around 10 p.m., as Booth descended upon Lincoln, Powell entered Seward's home on Lafayette Square, where the Secretary of State was convalescing in bed after suffering a debilitating carriage accident just a few days before. Powell was armed with a concealed revolver and a knife. He entered the dwelling under the auspices of delivering medicine on the orders of Seward's doctor. This claim raised the suspicions of the butler William Bell, who had asked the visitor to hold on, just wait a minute, while he checked to see if this made any sense, as the doctor had just been there an hour before. But Powell was a man on a mission, and he pushed past the butler, and he ascended the staircase, where he was met by Seward's son, Frederick. A scuffle ensued, and Powell attempted to shoot Frederick in the head, but the gun misfired. He then pistol-whipped the younger Seward, knocking him to the ground. Now he bounds into Seward's room, where he encountered 4 people: the ailing Secretary of State himself, Seward's daughter Fanny, his nurse, and a man that was there to protect him, and that was Sergeant George Robinson. So now Powell stabbed Robinson and then pounced on the bed, proceeding to slash Seward in the face and the throat. Alerted by the mayhem, Seward's other son, Augustus, enters the room and wrestles with Powell. Powell then stabs Augustus and then again stabs Robinson. He stabs another man on his way out of the house, and he shrieks, I'm mad, as if that's not obvious, and he mounts his waiting horse and he flees into the night. He managed to evade capture for a few days by hiding in either a cemetery or a tree, or maybe both. Accounts differ. Eventually, he returns to the Surratt boarding house, just as agents were interrogating other boarders there. Why he did this, I don't know. But when questioned, he claimed to be a laborer, but his story was found to be unconvincing, and he was taken into custody. Powell was found to have ammunition as well as personal effects, probably belonging to Booth, on his person, and though he claimed to be just a day laborer, earning less than $1 a day, he had $25 in his wallet. Positively identified by Seward's butler, Mr. Bell, as well as his son Augustus, he was formally arrested and imprisoned aboard the USS Saugus, a ship anchored in the Anacostia River. Aboard this prison ship, he was heavily manacled with an iron ball around his leg, and while no reporters were allowed to visit, for some reason, a very prominent photographer, and that would be Alexander Gardner, was allowed to visit, and he took many fascinating pictures of him, as well as the other accused conspirators. On April 29th, Powell and the other prisoners were moved to cells at the Washington Arsenal and kept in very Spartan conditions. Powell banged his head repeatedly against the walls of his cell, and a very oppressive hood was secured to his head 24 hours a day. And after this, his sanity becomes questionable if it wasn't before, but he's ultimately ruled sane to stand trial. And the 8 conspirators were all tried simultaneously beginning May 9th by the military tribunal. Powell refused to cooperate with the attorney assigned to him for most of the trial, but it doesn't seem to really matter, as the evidence against him was overwhelming. Also, 3 of his victims directly implicated him in the assaults. When he was required to speak, his responses were rambling, and he claimed to not even know his age or place of birth. Powell's attorney made no direct attempt to establish innocence, but instead the defense simply rested on the fact that he was insane and that his life should be spared as he had not committed murder. On June 29th, Powell was found guilty and he was sentenced to death. The new president, Andrew Johnson, approved the sentence on July 5th, and Powell was reported to have stoically accepted his fate. Interestingly, Powell asked to see 2 ministers, an Episcopalian Southern sympathizer and a Baptist of strong Union sympathies. It seems like it would be the other way, but that's what it was. And he wept profusely, and he confessed remorse and notably, quote, blamed Confederate leaders for his predicament. Powell spent his last night on earth alternately praying and weeping, and he stridently defended Mary Surratt, another of the condemned who we'll be discussing shortly. And he begged in vain to spare her, adamantly claiming she played no role in the plot. He was the only one of the conspirators, by the way, to defend her. And he was led to the gallows along with her and the others condemned on the early afternoon of July 7th. Among his final words were, quote, Mrs. Surratt is innocent. She doesn't deserve to die with the rest of us. Well, now another hood, the death hood, was placed on his head, as was the custom, and he whispered to the executioner, quote, I thank you, goodbye. As the platform dropped, Powell's neck was not broken, and his body contorted wildly for approximately 5 minutes until he breathed his last breath. Like the others, including Booth, he was buried in the prison yard until an order was issued in 1869, allowing the families of the condemned to retrieve their remains. Another crucial player in this whole hot mess was David Harold, who was born in D.C. in June of 1842, the 7th of 11 children, but each of his 3 brothers predeceased him, leaving him to be raised with 7 sisters. His family was quite affluent, and his father owned several properties in and around D.C. and around Maryland. He was a childhood friend of John Surratt, who eventually introduced him to Booth, and he soon eagerly joined the inner circle. On the appointed big day, he was charged to accompany Powell to Seward's house, and he did. But in the commotion that ensued there, he seemed to have panicked and instead somehow reconnoitered with Booth, and he headed off on horseback into the wilds and beyond. Harold and Booth rode to Dr. Mudd's house and then were provided sanctuary at the home of Samuel Cox, a Confederate sympathizer, who also provided them with a small boat to ford the river into Virginia. After roughly 2 weeks on the lam, he was trapped in the barn with Booth, and after being surrounded by Union soldiers, Harold quickly surrendered while Booth faithfully and fatally refused. Of all the conspirators, his guilt was least in question, as he had freely admitted to his role in the plot. He was unanimously sentenced to death by the tribunal on July 7th of 1865, and like Lewis Powell, his neck did not break at the gallows, and he strangled to death after wriggling for about 5 minutes. His remains now lay at the Congressional Cemetery in D.C. next to those of his sister. We'll say a little bit here about the next guy, George Atzerodt. George Atzerodt was the only foreign-born member of this gang, and he was born in Prussia, now Germany, in 1843, and he immigrated with his family to Maryland when he was 8 years old. He was known to not only have a great command of the English language, but he also seems to have not had a great command of his own mental capacities. Let's just say he was a dim bulb. What he was known for, however, was to be an ardent supporter of the rebel cause, and he too was introduced to Booth by John Surratt. And he's yet another to admit joining in the kidnapping plot, but denied any knowledge of the assassination plans. This is also highly implausible, as he was assigned to kill the Vice President, Andrew Johnson. And to that end, he checked into the Kirkwood House in Washington on the big day. And this was not a coincidence, as it was the very hotel where Johnson resided. He was known to have drank heavily during the chosen day, and the bartender there became very suspicious of him, as he was continually badgered by Atzerodt as to the comings and goings of the vice president. He was next seen wandering drunkenly through the streets of D.C., mumbling to himself on that fateful day, and he would ultimately slunk out of the dastardly deed that he had been assigned. He was noticed by a passerby to discard his would-be murder weapon, a knife, into a gutter, and this woman alerted the cops. Now the cops were on the beat, and they raided his hotel room, where they discovered a revolver and another Bowie knife poorly concealed in the mattress. Even more damningly, they found documents to him written in Booth's own hand. He was arrested at his cousin's farm in the aptly named Germantown, Maryland, a few days later. At trial with the others accused, his lawyer consistently asserted that Atzerodt was known as a, quote, notorious coward, and he called witnesses to vouch to the same. Well, I'm not sure that cowardice is much of a defense, and he eventually confessed at trial that he learned of the fatal plans just hours before, and that in fact Booth had ordered Harold, not he, to kill Johnson, and that he only was meant to be a lookout. But nobody's buying it, and he was swiftly sentenced to death for his would-be role, and he was hanged along with the others. His last words were, quote, "May we all meet in the other world. God take me now." Well, I don't know about you guys, but I don't really wish to hang out with these folks in the other world. He was buried at Glenwood Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Now we come to the last of the doomed, and this is Mary Surratt, and we probably should have started with her first, as the genesis of this whole debacle probably began one way or another under her tacit or direct supervision. She was born Mary Elizabeth Jenkins in Waterloo, Maryland, in either 1820 or 1823. The dates are disputed. So either way, she was obviously the eldest of the gang, and after all, she was the mother of John. She became a Catholic convert and was known to be particularly devout in her faith, which obviously carried on to her son. She was married to John Harrison Surratt, who owned a tavern and an inn. The marriage was fragile, and it was fraught with problems. The Surratts originally inherited and then eventually purchased an estate of 1,200 acres, worked by scores of slaves. But this continually dwindled in size due to financial woes and John's habitual alcoholism. She and her husband were known to be very keen Confederate sympathizers, and their properties were known to be very rebel-friendly. As such, Union authorities were aware of the clandestine movements of Confederate spies that assembled there and would come and go. Her husband died in 1862, and she moves to D.C. and begins to operate a boarding house there. Booth was a regular lodger at this place, and he became friends with her and her wider family. It remains a point of controversy whether or not she created the boarding house purely for financial gain or to further Confederate spy operations in the city, or maybe both. All of the conspirators eventually admitted to using Mary Surratt's property as a stash house for weapons and supplies intended for the kidnapping plot, and it's indisputable that a cache of weapons were stored there in advance of the assassination. So she had been on the radar for some time, and within hours of the assassination, police stormed the Surratt house. Cops found a picture of Booth in her room at the boarding house, along with a portrait of Jefferson Davis and a mold to make bullets. Uh-oh, somebody's in trouble. Big trouble. I guess it's no surprise she was quickly arrested and charged with conspiracy and transferred to the Washington Arsenal along with the others. 2 armed guards were stationed outside her cell. Kind of curious because only one was stationed outside of the other cells. But there were 2 men, John Lloyd and Louis Weichman, both familiar with various details of the plot, that provided the most damning testimony of her and of her acquaintances or friendships with Booth and the others. 31 witnesses testified unconvincingly for the defense, mostly testifying to her solid moral character and her loyalty to the Union. The Union? I don't know how many folks above the Mason-Dixon line had portraits of old Jeff Davis on their parlor walls. The tribunal convened on June 29th and sentenced her to death. Powell, as we've learned, was the only convicted conspirator to swear to her innocence. 5 of the 9 judges appealed to Andrew Johnson for clemency, though, based mostly on her gender, it said. It's unclear whether the new president rejected or even saw the appeal, but nevertheless the verdict proceeded and was carried out. She was inconsolable when learning of her sentence and prayed and wept nonstop alongside 2 priests and her daughter, who was a daily visitor. She was also suffering immensely from menstrual cramps and was given wine by the priest to try to soothe her in her final hours. Surratt led the procession to the gallows, dressed all in black, having to be supported by 2 soldiers and her priest as she was having difficulty walking. She complained that the bindings on her wrists hurt her, and the attending soldier purportedly remarked, quote, "Well, it won't hurt long." Now, I don't know if that's true, but it's colorful. I also just want to point out that the executioner was a man named Mr. Wrath. And we've had some great executioner names here in these podcasts. I can remember a Mr. Hurry and a Mr. Roper. But Mr. Wrath is a great name. And interestingly, he tied just 5 knots on her rope rather than the standard 7. Well, at the time of reckoning, the trapdoor drops, and unlike 2 of the others, she appeared to die instantaneously, but later reports confirmed that her neck was not broken, and her body swayed back and forth for quite some time. And on the night of this execution, a mob of scavengers descended on the boarding house, looting macabre souvenirs and selling them for profit. She's very notable as the first woman executed by the U.S. federal government, and her remains are buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in D.C. So there you have it, a brief review of the primary players in the plot to wipe out the power structure of the American government of the day. And if you're curious to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend the great work of the Surratt Society, and in particular Dave Taylor. These guys are the true experts on the subject. They do a fantastic job in distilling in meticulous detail the whole big drama, and there's lots of rich detail to be found from them online and elsewhere.
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.